It's time again for Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon. patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. The three most recent presidents of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints died at ages 101, 90, and 97. In fact, not counting founder Joseph Smith, church presidents lived to an average age of 87. And the current leader, Dallin Oaks, is 93. Decades ago, Apostle Hugh B. a self-proclaimed, quote, rebel, saw this emerging gerontocracy as a problem and proposed a remedy, which included granting emeritus status to all apostles, even members of the governing First Presidency at age 70. In fact, Brown wasn't particularly fond of how tradition has enshrined the process of picking church presidents and attempted to change it. Historian Matthew Harris, author of the acclaimed Second-Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality, and who is writing a biography of Brown, joins us today remotely to discuss the apostles' views on succession and aging leaders. Matt, welcome.
Hey, Dave. Hi, Peggy. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Okay, so when did the current practice of presidential succession, in which the senior apostle becomes the church president, become established?
Well, I think you have to go back to Joseph Smith when he was murdered in 1844. He left a lot of different instructions, depending on the context, in terms of who would succeed him. Just a couple of examples would be his son would be one of his successors, or the Quorum of the 12, or one of his special designees. I mean, there were a number of different options that he put out. And it just so happened that Brigham Young, as the most senior apostle, became the leader and succeeded him. But that was not enshrined in stone in 1844 or 50 or 46, I guess. Anyway, it wasn't until 1900 where it really it was codified into what it is today. But even before 1900, there were still apostles like George Q. Canton, Lorenzo Snow, and also Heber J. Grant, who thought it was not doctrine. It wasn't, there was nothing about it in scripture. It was just a practice. And frankly, they didn't like it. They thought that the Quorum of the 12 should be able to choose the next president.
So speaking of Heber J. Grant, what did he say about the most senior apostle becoming the president?
Yeah, he wrote this letter in 1887 to Wilford Woodruff. And I think this is before Woodruff was the church president. So this would be 87. I think he was 89. Anyway, he wrote a letter and he said that it's not right that just the most senior person should lead. It ought to be somebody who's fit, who's vigorous, who's alert, and who has the full support of the quorum. And obviously his was a minority position, but he felt strongly about it. And he carried those views throughout his life. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in just a second, but he shared some of those views with Hugh Brown.
So when he wrote that in 1887, he was in his 20s, right?
He would have been a young man, correct. Yeah, and I think a lot of it, the context, Peggy, is that Brigham Young had ordained two of his sons as apostles, one of whom was 11, and then he was later reordained at the age of 19. And then Brigham Young, this was, I think, John Young, and then Brigham Young Jr. was ordained at the age of 27, but they were not ordained in the quorum itself. They were just ordained apostles. And so it became a matter of discussion when they talked about seniority. Do they include Young's sons, or do they include people who were enshrined into the quorum itself? And obviously it was the latter position that won the day.
So we're going to fast forward now through history here to when Brown is an apostle and David O. McKay. At one point, Brown said he didn't think and wrote that he didn't think McKay was capable of running the church anymore. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no controversy there, Dave. So So Hugh Brown, when he was put into the First Presidency in the early 60s, he recognized right away that President McKay, who'd been the church president since the early 50s, he was once vigorous and hardy and robust, and anybody who'd worked with him knew about his physical stature, his mental stature. But by the early 60s, when he was approaching 90, his cognitive abilities began to decline. And Hugh Brown recognized that he couldn't make decisions. And in that vacuum, Hugh Brown and his cousin, or his nephew, excuse me, and Eldon Tanner, the other counselor in the First Presidency, they were running the church. And Hugh Brown didn't keep that to himself. He was out fishing one day in Alaska with some of the priesthood leaders of the Alaska High Council. And he brought his friend Jim Faust with him, who was not an apostle yet. He was just a ranking leader in the Democratic Party at the time in Utah. Anyway, so Hugh Brown and Jim Faust were out fishing with the Alaska High Council on this nice boat. And Brown says, "Let me tell you what's going on at church headquarters. President McKay's not running the church. And if you think he's not running the church, the guy next in line, Joseph Fielding Smith, he's not capable of running the church either." And then Faust, he interjects and says, "That's true. It's true." And the funny thing about this story is that one of the men, the priesthood men in the boat, his wife was cousins with President McKay's secretary. So he gets off the boat, of course, goes home, tells his wife about this very interesting conversation that he had with President Brown. And the wife, of course, calls Clara Middlemas and essentially says, "Do you know what President Brown's saying about President McKay? That he's not capable of running the church." And so President Brown goes home from that fishing trip to a very angry church president and a very angry secretary in Clara Middlemas. And
it's really interesting what you say about David O. McKay, because when you read the biography of David O. McKay, based largely on Clara Middlemas's a lot of the recordings and writings, you get the sense that people would go to McKay's office and they think that he's on board with something, then he's not, and other people come in. Am I remembering right from my reading of that book and others?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, the leadership, President McKay, President Smith, and some others, I mean, it creates an issue in the church at the highest level because President McKay is sad to say, but he's a micromanager. There is a great account that I have in my research files where there's a Christmas party for the general authorities, and he wants to give his approval on how many turkeys they're going to buy. And, he's 92 at this age. And just to give a contrast, Heber J. Grant was not well in his latter years either, but he told his counselor, J. Reuben Clark, he said, "I'm not doing well. You make the decisions. I'll support what you do." But President McKay was just the opposite. And so it creates a lot of hardship. And so what happens is that President McKay will ultimately lose some trust with President McKay and President Tanner. And that's the context in which he adds additional counselors to the First Presidency.
So Hugh Brown, he suggested leapfrogging over 93-year-old Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the next in line, and appoint 70-year-old Harold Lee as president. Is that right? Why did you do that?
Yeah, so President McKay had been on the decline for a long time. And by the fall of 1969, it becomes a crisis. Because in October of that year, President McKay falls into a coma. And there's now this crisis, who's going to lead? And Brown is really upset. He knows that President Smith, as the most senior apostle, is next in line to be the president, but he doesn't think he's fit either. And he talks about this. He goes around to some of the other apostles and he says, "We can't support this." He sleeps through his meetings, repeats himself, he forgets things. And so let's turn to 70-year-old Harold Lee. He's the next in line for the presidency after President Smith. He's vigorous. He's intelligent. He'll be a good leader. This is what we need. This is the image we need to project. But yet the brethren veto that because they're wedded to tradition.
I find that fascinating because at least later, Harold B. Lee seems at odds with Hugh B. Brown on a lot of big issues. Like maybe the priesthood ban?
Yeah, that's an understatement. They have just a quick backstory. They used to be really close friends in the 1930s, 40s. In fact, Harold Lee is the one that really lobbied hard to get Hugh Brown to become a general authority. He really, really exerted the influence that he had among his colleagues. And so they were close friends. When just quickly, when Hugh Brown's son died in World War II, it was Harold Lee wrote this beautiful letter of condolence. When Hugh Brown's wife, Zina Card Brown, had a stroke in 1966, it was Elder Lee who came and gave her this beautiful priesthood blessing. And then they had a number of issues that drove them apart. One of which you mentioned is the priesthood ban, but another is that Harold Lee thought that he ought to be in the First Presidency. And in the other, he was the most influential apostle throughout the 50s and 60s. They all recognized that. They all commented on that. And so whatever personal differences that Hugh Brown had with Harold Lee, he recognized that it ought to be his position because he had the respect of his colleagues.
So did any of the other leaders, is there any indication that any other leaders at the time supported Brown's effort to try to bypass Joseph Fielding Smith?
They thought about it, Dave. They did. They talked about it. Brown went around and he lobbied, at least, no, I don't know about the entire 12, but he certainly lobbied with his people that he thought would be sympathetic to the position, one of whom was Spencer Kimball. Another was Alvin Dyer. And he was very open in expressing himself that we can't appoint Joseph Fielding. He's 93. He's not doing well. And in January of 1970, this is just a couple of weeks before President McKay passed away, or just a short period before he passed away. They were in a meeting with Joseph Fielding Smith. And right in the middle of the meeting, he just fell down and conked his head on the table, passed out. He had I think it was some artery blood flow issue to his brain, and he just biffed it on the table. And that just reconfirmed in Hugh Brown's mind that he's not ready to be the president. It turns out that he was the president. And in April of 1970, when he gave his first General Conference talk, the brethren are really nervous that he's going to embarrass himself and stumble over his words. And when he makes it through fairly decently, they write in their diaries, we dodged a bullet. He didn't, embarrass himself, didn't embarrass us. One last little point on that is that 2 weeks after he gave his first General Conference address as the president, he went to a temple dedication in, I think it was LA or Oakland, rather. Not a dedication. He went to ordain, confer the sealing power on one of the priesthood men in that area. And in the blessing, he started out by saying that I'm here acting under the direction of President David O. McKay, who has vested these sealing keys into me. And as he's saying that in the blessing, one of his aides whispers in his ear, "You're the prophet now. President McKay is no longer with us." And then he has to start the blessing over again. And certainly I'm saying that respectfully, but that's what's going on with somebody who's at age 93.
Yeah, it's difficult to age on stage, as they say. You know what I mean? To be out there where everyone can see you. Joseph Fielding Smith actually was the oldest to become president of the church at the time. Russell Nelson is second, but, so it seems like a difficult thing, which is probably what gives rise to some of these Hugh B. Brown's thoughts, right, on this subject.
Yeah, even Hugh B. Brown, when he's nearing the end of his life, this is about 1974. He'll pass away in December of 75. But in his early 90s, he's just, I'm washed up. I don't want to go out on stage anymore. I'm done. My health isn't well. And Spencer Kimball approached Hugh B. Brown and said, "Look, we want you to speak at the Washington, D.C. temple dedication." And he didn't want to do it, but the president talked him into it. And so he invited his physician, a younger man named Russell Nelson, to accompany him. And what's interesting about that experience is that Hugh Brown was terrified as his son wheeled him up to the podium in his wheelchair. He was terrified that he would make a flub, that he would embarrass himself. And his kids talk about this in their diaries. They would write something like, "Daddy, we prayed for Daddy. He gave this beautiful message at the temple dedication. Oh, that's an answer to a prayer." because they were the entire family, including Hugh Brown himself, they were terrified that this wouldn't go as they had hoped, but it did.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 107, it says the apostles have to be unified when making decisions. What did Hugh Brown think about that?
Hugh Brown, I mean, he agreed with that. The difference is that when it came to policy or things that he saw as policy or tradition, he didn't agree with it. He thought that it could be changed by administrative fiat, whereas anything that would be doctrinal ought to be, of course, the unified voice of the 15. So the top leaders, top quorums of the church. And so he would frequently quote section 107 when it served his purposes, when he thought there was something doctrinal on the line. But that's the key issue, right? A lot of the things that he thought was policy, the rest of the brethren thought were doctrines.
So how did Hugh B. Brown want church presidents to be chosen?
In private. And before I answer that, let me just take you back in time for a quick moment. In the 1930s, Hugh Brown was a part of a study group in Salt Lake. He was a stake president, and there was another stake president as a part of that study group, a guy named Harold Lee. There was another person who was a stake president, a guy named Marion Romney. And there were some other folks there. And Reuben Clark, who was now in the church leadership in the First Presidency, he would occasionally attend their meetings. They're talking about things. And Harold Lee said something interesting, reflecting back on those years. He said that we would often tear the church down and then build it back up. And, and anyway, well, they would read different church books like John Henry Evans' book on Joseph Smith, that biography that was published in 1933. They read B.H. Roberts' History of the Church. Well, they were talking about presidential succession one day, and they had heard that it was a rumor or that it was a policy, not really a doctrine. So they called in the church president. And Hugh Brown said, hey, I know him well. He was my mission president. And so they called in President Grant, and they just bombarded him with questions about this succession tradition. And that's what he said. He said, this is just a tradition. And he quoted that 1887 letter that he had written years earlier that I referenced earlier in the podcast here. So they came away from that. All of the brethren know it's a tradition because they have heard it from Grant and others. And so Brown thought that the apostles, by a simple majority, should be able to choose who the president ought to be. And you can imagine there'd be a little lobbying going on to make sure that their guy is the person, that there's enough consensus with this particular person. And so that's what he did. He didn't offer a ton of details about it. He just simply said that it ought to be chosen in private among the 12 with a simple majority.
So did he worry about, a lot of people say, oh, then that would introduce politicking into the process. And a lot of Latter-day Saints don't like any hint of politicking. Did he worry about that? No,
because that personified who he was. He was Mr. Politic. He was, I mean, to strip Hugh Brown away from politics would be to strip him entirely. And he was, just for example, he was the head of the Democratic Party in the 1930s. And just a quick thought, the biggest difference between, a lot of differences between Elder Benson, Ezra Taft Benson, his colleague, and himself, wasn't about politics. They both were, as Aristotle put it, they both were political animals. The difference is that Elder Benson felt no compunction about sharing his politics in general conference and in state conferences. Brown was more circumspect, only offering his views in private to Latter-day Saints who would ask about Elder Benson's, talks or whatever. But he was definitely political and recognized that in order to be a good leader, you have to build coalitions. And so in Brown's, in his life, he would oftentimes meet with people in private, and he would share his views and listen to them and try to win them over. And he employed that same strategy when he was an apostle and also in the First Presidency.
So, Matt, he would see if the top leaders are getting together to choose the new leader, he would see that give and take of debate, who should it be, would be healthy in his mind, right? I mean, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, 100%. And that's healthy. And I think, just by the way, I think there's something that I think your listeners would profit from this, which is that Hugh Brown described Revelation as a discussion and a debate where we thrash out principles. That's the word he used, thrash out. And he said that once we reach an agreement, then we pray about it. And then that's when the church president says, I feel like a revelation has been achieved. So the entire revelatory process was one of discussion, debate for Hugh Brown.
Now, he proposed, as we said in the intro, an emeritus status for all the apostles, including the members of the First Presidency. Eventually, the church would adopt something like that, but after he died, but for general authority 70s, if Brown had still been around when they did that, would he have been pushing for, hey, we need to take it beyond just the 70s, right? I mean, that was his thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, because he tried to do that while he lived. And he made that proposal after he resumed his place of seniority in the Quorum of the 12. So this is after he was dropped in the First Presidency. And he already had strong feelings about so-called old men running the church, as he put it. And what really led him to make this particular proposal was he had sat through a series of meetings with Joseph Fielding Smith, the new president, and 7 hours worth, and he didn't say anything, didn't say a word, just sat there. And so it just reconfirmed in Brown's mind that something's amiss. So President Brown died in 1975, and it wasn't until 1978 where Imelda Tanner, his nephew, announced in General Conference that every quorum of the church, at least those beneath the Quorum of the 12, would be emeritized at the age of 70. And Hugh Brown would have supported that, but he also thought that it should apply to the top two quorums. And what's funny about him is when he made the proposal, he told his grandson, he said, I'm sure they're going to accept it because I'm going to be the first casualty of my proposal and they don't like me.
So he wouldn't have benefited, right? As far as going up, he was beyond 70, right?
Oh, he was in his 90s. He was 89 when he made the proposal. So yeah. he would have been the first person to go fishing full time.
So a couple of younger men, Marion Hanks and Paul Dunn, lots of our listeners may know of them. How did they influence Brown's view?
Yeah, Hugh Brown was close friends with Marion Hanks and Paul Dunn, especially at the latter part of his life. And there's a lot of stuff we could say about their relationship. But Elder Hanks and Elder Dunn, they were asked by President McKay to look into creating a policy that would emeritize members of the Quorum of the 70, their quorum. And it was above their pay grade, of course, to create something for the 12 and the First Presidency. So they did it for the first quorum of the 70. And the proviso was that President McKay said there had to be unanimity among that quorum in order for it to go forward. And there was a holdout. No way. I'm not going to retire myself. I mean, he didn't want to do it. And so it didn't go through in the 60s when it was first proposed. And then by 1978, when they resumed discussion of that proposal, that holdout had passed away by then. And that's why it was pushed through in 1978 and not 15 years earlier.
Was Hugh B. Brown more worried about the physical ability of aging leaders or their mental acuity, or maybe both? I mean, is there any indication what was his biggest fear?
Yeah, both. Definitely both. But the big one would be mental acuity. He talks about often that as he gets older, it's really tragic in so many ways. And obviously it'll happen to the best of us as we all age. But he talks about, feeling frustrated that he's not as sharp as he once was. And he would frequently make jokes about it to his colleagues, and they would repeat those interactions with him in their own diaries. I saw President Brown today, and he says he's not feeling as well or as sharp mentally as he once did, but I still think he's fairly sharp. They'll say things like that, but he's really aware of it. And he's also aware of some of the medications and their effect that they're having on him. He has Parkinson's disease. And so he's taking a brand new drug on the market called L-Dopa. And it just frustrates him to no end that it's doing things to his mind. And he knows it. His kids observe it. And, but that's just something that he had to do to ease his pain.
So do you think there's any traction today among the top leaders to apply emeritus status to the 12 in the First Presidency? They are older. You know?
Yeah, there is. I have a really good, well-placed source that tells me that when Pope Benedict died in 2013, that it resumed discussions among the leaders, the brethren then, where they talked about emeritus. And I don't know all the details, but I do know that they talked about it. And obviously with Pope Benedict retiring, rather, that was a break in tradition. And then his successor, Pope Francis, Catholic watchers, myself included, thought that, hey, he may retire as well. Turns out he didn't retire. He died in the papacy. And then, of course, Pope Leo today, we'll see what he does. But so the Catholics didn't really create that tradition of retirement that some had thought and maybe even hoped. But it did spark discussion among the leaders in Salt Lake.
Given the medical advances that keeping people alive longer, essentially, this trend is likely to continue, and the ages of church presidents and leaders are likely to continue to climb higher. Under Brown's plan, if it had been adopted, only 3 apostles of the current leadership would still be in their positions: Ulysses Soares, Patrick Carron, and Clark Gilbert. That would eliminate a lot of people. Did Brown entertain the notion of maybe, the emeritus age should be higher, like, say, 80? Might that be more practical?
No, he said 70. That's why in my column, I called it radical. I was not being hyperbolic. I mean, this is a radical thought. And the idea would be the church president would remain, because you can't eliminate, 15 leaders. But the church president would remain, as would the priesthood brethren under 70. And then when they hit 70, they're out. And so you have to start somewhere. And obviously there would have been some growing pains, because if his proposal would have passed in 1970, they would have gotten rid of 75% of the quorum then. I mean, that's extraordinary. But yeah, Hugh Brown thought it was the right thing to do for the church.
Okay, so one last question from me. Do you see any downsides of retiring apostles at even 75 or 80 that don't exist in the current system? What would be the downside of doing this?
No, that's a good question. I think one would be institutional memory. I mean, the brethren operate, I don't mean to be crass when I say this, but sometimes they operate like the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court used to operate, which is based on precedent. And so they do look at meeting minutes quite often about how prior first presidencies governed or ruled on certain issues. And if you had younger men there, they wouldn't have been a part of those discussions. Certainly they could read about them, but reading about them and being a part of them are two different things. I think we would miss that institutional memory, which I think is really valuable. And also, you might miss some connections. As an older leader, you meet a lot of people in the church, particularly people that you may think could be a good bishop, a good stake president, a good temple president, and younger men might not have, those connections.
Well, Matt Harris's recent column on this can be found at sltrib.com. Matt Harris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Peggy.
We look forward to the new book, okay?
Yeah, me too.
Keep us posted.
I will.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.